throughout our history, we've seen movements come out of, like, or catalyzed by these very public spectacles of violence. And so the reaction to violence becomes the primary thing that moves people, and then the conversation of, like, okay, if not this, then what? So I think that that conversation was happening, and for me and for other folks I work with, both folks who work nationally and locally, they were really similar conversations. Like, people were talking about the need to divest from this system, talking about how rotten the roots of this system were, and folks saying, like I organized in public housing before Michael Brown and all of this, and, like, I call it, like, it reminds me of my grandmother. There's this kind of narrative of, like, yes, the cops are bad, yes, this is a racist country, but we need police and we need jails because, like, I'm scared. And I'm scared for where I live, I'm scared for what will happen to me, I'm scared for my family, I'm scared for, like, the good kids. And I think that there was this moment where people in communities were having different kinds of conversations about the inability to trust and illegitimacy of these state actors, whether it be police and of our courts. And so it felt like a really important time to really articulate that alignment that we were seeing, that there was some general alignment around this idea of, number one, like, we have to divest from these systems, and that we can't just embrace a progressive agenda that creates a safety net if we're continuing to cage and surveil and kill and hurt and undermine and divest from our people, that those two things can't exist at the same time. And then reparations of, like, we would not ever get over this moment or get over this situation if we don't actually acknowledge the full depth of what our history has created for us and what situation we're facing, and how deeply embedded ideas around white supremacy, around anti-blackness, around violence, around control, around disposability are in all of these systems, from the education system to the child welfare system to the criminal justice system, and the ways that they play out. And if we don't make reparations for that, if we don't acknowledge, like, analyze, figure out what we must repair and then repair it, and embed that in our curriculums and our memorialization and our culture, that we won't ever, we'll just keep on recreating this moment, that we saw the recreation of slavery through convict leasing. We saw that kind of transform into Jim Crow. We saw that transform into mass incarceration, that we'll continue to see these symptoms and see this reiteration unless we actually repair the roots and have a conversation about that. So there was a sense, I think, across the board that folks were aligned around some really deep principles, and that those had real implications, not just for our political education, but also for our policy. And that we had watched for decades, after every single kind of movement that's compromised around policy, that in fact always legitimizes and proliferates capitalism and industries that benefit from exploitation, and also undermines our people and our ability to control our own institutions. That has happened over and over again. That is the story of neoliberalism. That's the story of the left and the right for the last 30 years. And how do we actually kind of articulate a vision that is contrary to that it's saying, like, we also have a stake in how this policy plays out. So I think there was this sense of alignment, this sense of urgency, and this kind of pushing back against false victories that really led to why it felt useful. It also, I think, for me, I was just constantly amazed by the organizers that I had the privilege of being in contact with, and just, like, how they were envisioning something completely different. And had this real sense that, like, to do that, we have to actually deconstruct what is, and then think about what are the mechanisms by which we create what could be. And that we should do that collectively. That shouldn't just be that, like, folks articulate a vision and then somebody in DC or somebody else gets to decide what that looks like, and, like, we know the devil is in the details, that it is the weeds that will cut us. So I think it felt really important to model a process, or try and model a process around how we create an agenda and alignment that mirrors the kind of politics that we want to live. And so that meant that the experts were folks who were organizing and impacted. It meant that we had to not weigh what we thought was possible, which is something that, like, I struggle with. I think law school tries to teach all of us that we shouldn't think past what we think is pragmatic or immediately possible. And that's an indoctrination that happens to our people. But instead to think about what was necessary and to have real conversations about, like, what has to happen, like, what has to become possible to make the necessary happen. And so I think the platform was an exercise in that, and in kind of collective envisioning, and then also, like, what parts of that vision translates into policy. Because clearly there are ways in which the state is incredibly predatory and don't belong in liberation spaces. So what are the places where we need to change policy to get there? And how do we lay out a roadmap and start thinking across silos to make that possible?